the Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast I'm speaking with Jessie Hemphill. Jessie is an Indigenous community planner and facilitator working in communities all across Canada. For me, Jessie is just someone I love talking to. So I'm going to keep the intro short because our conversation is long. I connected with Jessie in an online call. She was at home in Nanaimo, BC. So, Jessie, can you start by talking a bit of about the identities that you lead with when you're walking through the world? Tell me a little bit about your background and how you see yourself.
Sure. So I Gwa'sala Nakwaxd'axw and Métis. I'm in Nanaimo territory right now, but I'm Kwakwakiwak, so I'm from the Nakwaxd'axw and Métis peoples of the Kwakwakiwak Nation, the Henderson family, and then also Métis on my dad's side, although I found that out later in life. So we're the Marion family from the Forks area in Winnipeg, and then a bunch of European, mostly Celtic, thrown in there as well from both sides. So that's my heritage, but I was really raised with a connection to my Nakwaxd'axw heritage in the Gwa'sala Nakwaxd'axw community in Port Hardy, which is where I grew up on the north end of Vancouver Island, British Columbia.
Can you describe what the language was that you just introduced yourself
with?
Yeah. Just for the people who are listening who are like, I think they're static. No, you were speaking something.
Sure. So Nugwa means I am, or my name is, and then Tlalilogula or Tlalilogwa is my Indian name, and it actually means bridge between the worlds in one interpretation of it. So I can talk about that more in a bit. And then I said Gayukan Lach, which means I come from. Nakwaxd'axw Lu means and, Ligwitlaw Lu Métis. And then I said Gela Kesla, which means thank you. Nanaimo, which is the name of the Indigenous people, the First Nation from the Nanaimo area. So my grandma told me that's a good way to introduce myself, to tell you who I am, where I come from, and to thank the people on whose land I am. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so what language were you speaking?
Lots of people know it as Kwakwa or Bakumkiala. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's the language of the northern tip of Vancouver Island.
Yeah, it's Southern Wakashan if you're a linguist. So also like the Central Coast has some dialects of part of that language group. Mm-hmm.
Wow, very cool. Okay, I sort of interjected, so
that's okay.
Please carry on, because of course I love that I suggested you come on the show and talk about being between two worlds, and that's your actual.
I know, it's
okay.
So awesome.
You just carry on. Yeah.
So I don't look super First Nations, even though that's the culture that I most identify with. So that's always been an interesting thing, that I have this ability, I think, to pass in either world, right? I can pass as white, but I can also, pass in my own community, obviously, and in First Nations communities. In Port Hardy, it's interesting because it's quite a rural place. So I have a rural, very nature-based upbringing. But then I went to university in Victoria, which for me is a city, and I do a lot of work now in cities. Nanaimo, where I live now, has about 100,000 people. So I have this mixed rural, urban lived experience as well. And then even in Port Hardy growing up, when I was in elementary school, we lived in town, not on reserve, but I went to elementary school on reserve and had lunch at my grandma's down the road every day. And then in high school, near the end of high school, we moved onto the reserve, but I was going to school in town. So back and forth all the time, just a foot in both worlds. And for my coming of age ceremony. When I was a young woman, my parents organized a feast where I got my name at that time, my coming of age name, my adult name, Tlalilogula, from Daisy Seawood Smith in Cam River. And it came from a dream that my mom had. And without going into detail, two interpretations I've heard are this bridge between the worlds, particularly the spiritual and the secular worlds, or the undersea kingdom and the world that we live in our mythology. And then another interpretation I've had is leader of the pack, kind of, or the whale pod, actually, or leadership in some sense. So I like that idea of bridging, being in between, not out front, but there's a leadership piece to that as well.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And then I think I just always, I was thinking about it this year, that my place seems to be in that in-between zone, or I think of it as like the knuckle between two things where they kind of rub up against each other. I seem to always be in that space of not 100% comfortable really anywhere, but I really like that in-between space. So whether it's kind of translating between rural and urban and translating the values of each to the other, or doing reconciliation work for non-Indigenous folks or with non-Indigenous folks, or bringing technical skills from academia into Indigenous communities, or advocating for women or youth or Indigenous people in seats of power within local government, or translating government policy when I'm doing work in communities. Like, this is where I seem to find myself really often, is knowing enough about each side to help bridge those gaps, to like be in that knuckle when not many other people want to be. But then the sacrifice is that you're never 100% belonging or comfortable in any of those spaces.
Well, and you also put yourself into what I can only imagine. I mean, honestly, when I think of my nightmare job or experience, it would be running for public office. And you did that at quite a young age. And so even then you were bridging between kind of this very, I'm going to say, adult establishment, power center of government, municipal government. It doesn't matter if you're in a small town, you still have to get elected, you still have to persuade, you still have to prove yourself, and you're also still targeted, or at least you become quite vulnerable because you're stepping out as a public figure. But you did this as a female, as an Indigenous woman, as a young woman, who really had lots of other things she could have been doing right then. So can you tell me about either the day or the moment or the incident that made you say, I'm going to run for public office?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story, actually. So yeah, in 2011, I ran for council for the district of Port Hardy. So this is not my band council, this is town council. And I ran, really, I'd had a lot of people in the community asking if I would consider running, and I had been in leadership roles since elementary school, student council, and then Aboriginal student rep at university. And I had been doing a lot of community work leading up to the election, but I think I genuinely thought that only businessmen were qualified to run for council.
Yeah.
Or that you needed to be a member of the Rotary Club or something. I just was confused about the qualifications, which I think is the case for most people. When we don't see ourselves reflected in those seats of power, we think they're not accessible to us, and that is not the case. But what happened was I'd had a few people asking if I would run, but then the mayor at the time, who was running for re-election, talked my husband into running for council, because he is a really outgoing, gregarious, community-minded guy. He's a person of color. He was working in education and the arts and different things, and she thought he would be a good fit. And so he decided to throw his hat in the ring. And he didn't grow up in Port Hardy. I dragged him up there. And so I thought, well, if you're going to run for council, I may as well run for council, and then we can do it together. And it'll be fun. We can spend time painting our signs and stuff. And I also had, senior sort of statesmen from the community taking my parents out for dinner to try and get them to put the pressure on and stuff. So Jermaine and I decided to run at the same time. And this is the beauty thing about small towns is just the investment is so much more about your social capital, I think, than your money. So I literally hand painted my own signs with my own face on them. And I made a pamphlet that outlined my platform. But I spelled my own last name wrong on it. And so I handed them out at the all candidates meeting. And then my mom spent the whole mingling time after the speeches collecting them back from people so nobody would notice. And that was it. So I spent $50 on my first campaign and I got in. I think I did pretty good.
Wait a second. How did Jermaine do?
Jermaine did not get in. But it was okay. And in retrospect, he's really glad he didn't because it ended up being a lot of work. And he's another cool thing. So my experience has been nothing but positive, really. Like, because I grew up there, I think, and I had a lot of family in town, really people were just so excited because I tick all the minority boxes. I'm a young woman and I'm First Nations. And there had been other people that had been on council that had family connections, or were status Indian, or from other communities and stuff. But I think I'm the first person to grow up there, to have connections to a local reserve and a local family, to be elected to council, and the youngest woman ever at age 27. And so I think everyone just kind of took me under their wing, but not in a patronizing way either. And I really, I'm really pleased. I know this is not everyone's experience being a minority, in a role like that, but I never felt patronized or disrespected, or that anyone treated me as though my age or my background were a disadvantage. And I had to argue for my ideas just like everybody else, but I was able to push some of them ahead and see positive changes in the community. And so I think particularly in small rural communities, anyone considering running for office, particularly if you are outside of the norm, you should totally do it. It's a very different thing, I think, in the smaller communities. It's much, I don't know, like a sweet, helpful, collaborative thing, or can be. I know not all councils get along, but ours really did. I was reelected in the last election, so elected for 2 terms. And although it was a lot of work and there's a lot of tedium involved, which I think may turn away people, there's a lot of tedium, a lot of hours, a lot of technical information, but it's such a great place to be and such a great place to advocate for your values and your people, and not this exclusive club that it's made out to be. And my sense is that the general population is so excited to see different, fresh faces in those roles that there's a lot of opportunity, especially for, like I say, people outside of the norm, the older white men. Nothing against them. There's some awesome older white men out there.
Yeah.
But
that's really heartening to hear that you had a great experience and that, your council was able to find some common ground and push things forward. Now you are continuing your education in community planning. And I find this really fascinating because I don't know if I could think of, I definitely could think of other areas, but in terms of just choosing a path that has a really colonizing stamp on it, I would think that community planning, right up there with all of the problems that we could think of with, settler culture imposing a way of being and, I could imagine there's a lot of problems there. So what are you thinking? What's your hope here?
Yeah, fair question. So I did my undergraduate degree at UVic in Victoria on linguistics, and I was going to do language revitalization. But in the last couple of years of my degree, I became really disillusioned with the feasibility of doing language revitalization without concurrent health improvements and educational improvements and economic development and governance reform and all these things. It just felt like the siloed approach to community building was not going to work. And so along came this job posting in my home community for a comprehensive community planning assistant. And I didn't really know much about it, but I applied and I got the job and sort of fell into this world of comprehensive community planning.
Can you kind of define that?
Yeah, I will.
It sounds really good, but I don't know that I've seen it in practice. So.
Yeah, this is a community planning model that was created by First Nations in British Columbia in the mid-2000s as a reaction against that kind of colonial planning you're talking about. So Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada requires Indian bands, quote unquote, to do all kinds of planning, like a health plan, asset management plan, financial plan, blah, blah, blah. And communities were just getting really sick of having to do all these plans with these templates created by the government, giving them information that was useful to the government, if at all, and certainly not to the communities. So these communities, First Nations communities, came up with this model, and they were like, we want to do planning that is comprehensive. So we want to honor the holistic connections between all these different areas, that health and education and governance and the land and our culture and infrastructure, all these things are all interconnected. We can't plan for any one of them without talking about the others. Then second of all, we want it to be long range. So we don't want to have to redo these plans for you every year or every 3 years. We think in like 25 to 100 year cycles, and we want to be allowed to plan on that time scale. And then thirdly, we want it to be created by the community. So we don't want you to force us to bring in professional planners or consulting companies to do these plans for us, with templates and checklists and in the municipal fashion. We want it to come from our community in an authentic way that reflects our local culture and context. And so amazingly, the federal government said, okay, we'll support that.
Okay, can I just stop you? That is amazing, because
Right?
we're talking about the Harper government, right?
No, or was it? Yeah, I guess it was. I mean, I gotta say,
like somebody was asleep at the wheel on that one.
Thank God, yeah. Well, yeah, Colette Anderson and later Bronwyn Geddes from INAC, BC region, have been amazing. I think Gwen Phillips described them as salmon swimming upstream, just fighting the good fight for years. So this model started then, and really it's just taken off. And now over half of BC's First Nations are doing comprehensive community plans, or CCPs, and just this year it's going national. So I think, yes, community planning has this terrible colonial history. My own nation was relocated from our homelands on the mainland to Vancouver Island in a really crappy way. But there's this reclamation, I think, of community planning as a way to do like grassroots kind of radical community planning that is also cultural revitalization, empowerment, connection with the land, bringing back language and culture, and building in conflict resolution processes in communities, just all the good things when it's done well. And it's done differently everywhere, and that's how it's supposed to work. So I think as a community planning model, it's really interesting and really different. And so I've been doing it for about 8 years now, working with communities all over Canada. And it just felt like a good time to go back to school, take a couple years. On the one hand, to make sure that I'm not missing any skills when I'm going out to work in our communities, but also to bring this cool model into planning academia. Because I think on the municipal side of things, we really missed the boat in community planning. I think the citizen engagement, participatory decision-making, conflict resolution instead of conflict avoidance, all these things are really happening in Indigenous communities or First Nations communities, but not so much in the municipal world. We kind of avoid conflict at all costs and are very reliant on consultants to drive the planning processes, and they really happen in a templated fashion. And so partly I wanted to go for the master's to bring this 8 years of lived experience in communities all over the place into the dialogue around current community planning practices in Canada.
Wow. I'm just feeling like, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, thank God somebody really good is doing this kind of work. I want to shift the conversation a little bit because you, in the beginning, you talked about growing up in this, beautiful rural setting. So, can you just go back to your childhood and tell us a little bit about, like, what was it like growing up as little Jessie in the forest by the sea? What was your upbringing like, going home to your grandma's? Like, what do you think about when you think about your childhood?
Oh yeah, I just get warm fuzzies. Oh man. I think my parents are so awesome. We're super tight. And when my parents moved to Port Hardy, a lot of their family, especially my mom's side, followed them up there. So when I was little Jessie, I had two sets of grandparents in Port Hardy, Grandma Jean and Grandpa Hemphill. So my non-First Nations grandparents, who took us to Sunday school and took us to the bunny park and to the playground and stuff, and the teas at church and just all the ladylike kind of stuff. And then my grandma Lucy and my grandpa Oscar on the reserve. So my mom's mom and her partner who took us out on the back roads and took us berry picking and to go look at the birds and just I don't know, softness and warmth, like just safe places all around. And then a ton of uncles and aunts and cousins and stuff. So I also have a younger sister by 2.5 years and then 9 years younger brother, Hussein Ritchie. And so growing up, just family everywhere, like tons of family gatherings, 30 people for Thanksgiving dinner, watching cartoons at grandma's with my cousins till way later than we should have. And, parties at our house, just everyone loving and laughing. And my mom worked actually, and my dad stayed home. My dad's an artist and my mom's our chief negotiator. So shifted gender roles. And then my dad also had a boat when I was a kid, an old Japanese fishing boat. So we spent a lot of time out on little islands for Easter picnics or over in Blenheim Harbor, out in the homelands, right? And really just my sister and I a lot of the time. So, and I was also quite an outcast in elementary school because I was a chubby, white-looking bookworm, kid with glasses and braces and a really different home life than a lot of the kids that I was going to school with. So I was really just a loner, like in the bushes all the time with my little jackknife and my, I don't know, but I don't, it was wonderful. It was a wonderful way to grow up, even that loner aspect. Just spending all that time alone in the woods and all that time with family and really bonding with the grown-ups in my life.
So who taught you, or who would you say mentored or held space for your spiritual life growing up?
This is a good question. You're poking at the soft underbelly, Carmen. I think, well, like I say, we had these two sets of grandparents that watched my sister and I a lot. So it was, first of all, my parents are both spiritual, I would say, but not explicitly not dogmatic. So we pray at home, but the form in which we pray or to whom we pray isn't so rigid. And so my dad's dad and stepmom, we had the Sunday school influence there, and they took us to church and Christmas services and stuff. And I think through them, I connected with the church community, the communal aspect of it. And certainly as a teenager, I was really involved in Christian youth group and the church community, and then fell away from it later on. But I have a lot of love and respect for for any religious community, in the sense that it brings people together. And there's that sense of communal purpose and connection to God or the Creator, and community service that was a really strong influence, I think. And yeah, just that idea of spiritual practice. But then on the other side, my grandma Lucy and grandpa Oscar, grandpa Oscar was a self-professed agnostic. So he was Finnish. So he wasn't, he passed away in April this year and wasn't really sure what he believed in. But my grandma Lucy was a very interesting mix of, some Christian influences, but also really nature, like God is in nature. And I remember as a kid her telling us not to kill creatures, even mosquitoes, because it could be a manifestation of God in that moment, and you're essentially killing God. You know, I remember being terrified of that as a kid, but also just building in this reverence for nature. And my parents really, I think my dad especially, has this idea that God's in everything. I mean, you go out in the woods and there's God, and you don't need to be in a church to pray. And then my granny, my dad's mom, who wasn't around as much, but still really close to her, Granny Marion, was also very, very religious, but in a cheeky kind of sweet way, you know, like the idea that God or Jesus snuggles her every night in her old age. And so she isn't lonely. She had spent time around nuns and different things. So quite a like mix. And then obviously the Kwak, the legends and the ideas of the spiritual world and our mythological figures, and the transformer, and all those different stories. So I think I grew up feeling like they all make sense and they all fit, and it just like the golden rule, right? As long as you're not hurting anybody, or do unto others, or however it manifests itself, that is important, and that you should have some sense of spiritual life. But when it gets dogmatic, or when you're judging or hurting other people because of their beliefs or your own, then that is getting away from the point of it all.
Mm-hmm. Can you, in the beginning of the interview, you were talking about this kind of, it almost seemed like this upper world where the humans dwell in the Kwak mythology, and then there's like the supernatural world was underwater or something.
Yeah.
Is it okay to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know as much about it as I would like to, but of course we're coastal people. Like our villages were built along the water, the shore front, and we were in canoes all the time. And so, yeah, in our cosmology, most of the supernatural creatures live under the sea. There's like the undersea kingdom, and the idea that there are big houses and, you know, feasts and different things happening under the world. And like, I don't know if it exactly corresponds with heaven, but my sense is that it's similar, just the spirit world is down there and we're up here. So rather than traveling up into the clouds to get to the spirit world, although I think we do have legends around that too, it's more like going under the surface of the water down to where the supernatural creatures were. And sometimes they would take off their animal form and become a different form. And sometimes people would go down and steal their robe or whatever and become their animal form, and different things like that. So a lot of things around transformation, which ties really into this idea too of intercultural and bridging, right? Experiences, the idea of being able to put on someone else's coat and assume their form for a while and like trick everyone into believing you until you get home and take it off.
Yeah, very magical and very trickster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because you don't know who you're dealing with then. And I think about what must a person believe or perceive about just the world in general if the kind of, I don't know, heaven, Valhalla, the supernatural place is under the water and you can't quite see and everything's kind of dimmed, and it's like you just have completely different senses. You don't even breathe air anymore. It's like, wow, that's really cool to be able to conjure an ability to sort of empathize or know a different way of being so well that you could imagine living there.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think about it too sometimes when I'm out on the boat. The idea, under the water, it's so dark and so cold and so different than in the sky. Yeah, how interesting that would be. There's just such a totally magical sense.
Yeah, totally. So I have to credit you, Jessie, and I'm going to do this publicly, with really completely changing the trajectory of my life simply by casting a spell with some words that you said. So we were both at a public event that our mutual friend Aftab Irfan was hosting, and she specializes in this group process format called Deep Democracy, and you can do all kinds of stuff with it, but one thing you can do is have civic dialogues. And Aftab had been asking my husband and I to come to this civic dialogue entitled, "Is Hope Bullshit?" And I was like, we're not going to that because we're just getting roped in as the only people that she can reliably know will stand on the yes, it's bullshit side. And like, I don't need to pay money to go and have a room full of people tell me that I'm being a Debbie Downer. Like, I'm not going to go. And eventually we got cajoled and I was like, fine, I'll go. And like, I'll stand on the side of, yes, it's bullshit. And let me tell you why. And so we go to this whole big day long thing, and it's as bad as I anticipated. I was like, I felt like I was having to hold up half the sky, as they say, right? Like, it was just like, yeah, the hopium in the room was like suffocating me. But we get to the end of the day, and here this woman, lovely Jessie Hemphill, who I wasn't friends with yet, but I knew of and slightly had been introduced to, stands up at the end and says, I see now and hear now that when I'm working in Indigenous communities and I don't hold space for collective expression and forms of grief and rage, I am doing a disservice to that community, and I am not helping anyone to move this process forward. And you just lasered in on it for me, that it was grief and rage, having public forums for the collective grief and rage, that not just Indigenous communities, but anybody. Suddenly I was like, oh my God, why don't we have space in our culture for grief or rage, since they are drivers and they're like ever present, scratch the surface. And you said, so this is the opportunity for people to subgroup and talk about other things. And you're like, I'm going to go over here in this corner and talk about grief and rage. And like 20 of us go over. And it was so brilliant because Myrna Lewis, the co-creator of this process, thought, I'm going to go over to where the heavy stuff is happening, and I'll help Jessie with the heavy lifting here of facilitating this discussion. And she has this beautiful way of like inviting anyone who wants to speak. And if you don't want to speak, you don't have to. But then she like makes eye contact with you, holds her palm open towards you in this imploring, warm kind of way. Would you like to speak? And she kept coming around to me. And of course, all I could do was bawl. I silently bawled and like defiantly bawled while other people talked. And I could not keep my shit together. I bawled and bawled and bawled. And it was the most cathartic thing. And it was like you gave me oxygen by saying the magic words grief and rage, and it like cast a spell. And I had this whole insight about how lonely conviction is, how lonely it is to talk about grief and rage. And it's helped me understand why, the reconciliation process, for instance, is so difficult, because where do settlers and white people put grief and rage and regret and remorse? And like, where do we put stuff? And how do we even face the graciousness that's been extended to us by so many First Nations neighbors of forgiveness and resilience and even opening conversation? Like, I mean, it's just completely opened my life in a very rich way. I've also been shattered a lot of the time, but I thank you for the opportunity to finally put language to it. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that and tell that story. But I want to end the show on the new closing question moving forward. I don't know if the Numinous podcast happens in seasons, but this is definitely a shift. And it's so perfect that you are my first guest for this, because it was it was gifted to me by you. I would like to know, Jessie, how do you cope with grief and rage when you look around at the world? What are the things that you do to manage those difficult emotions?
Oh, probably a lot of unhealthy things that I'm trying to grow out of. Although sometimes I have a serious answer to this, but sometimes it's just about committing to a bottle of wine and like a 4 a.m. Netflix binge.
I was totally going to say, do you drink? I drink. I drink cocktails.
Yeah.
And I feel so much better. And I'm not trying to condone alcoholism.
No, I'm definitely trying to grow out of that habit. But I think a first step in that for me has been like just if I know that that's something, especially with death, like with certain things that are just too big, it's like, I'm not going to draw this out over a couple weeks. I'm going to like polish off a whole bottle tonight and just weep into my pillow and stay up way too late. And Jermaine, my husband, I'll give him the warning not to worry about me, that I'm going to be okay tomorrow. But really, I think I've been trying to develop healthier tools around this lately. And so it's so like typical new age urbanite, but yoga, like yin yoga in particular, has been a mental health saving grace for me this last couple of years when I've been away from my family. So I think it used to be family, right? That we would just get together and have a dinner or hang out together and cry together or whatever, just that share that sense of grief. You know, I had a young cousin pass away a couple years ago, and within a day there was like 20 of us that had just dropped everything and went to Campbell River, and then we rented a big house and just stayed there for a week, like just like 20 of us all together, just like, you know, going through it together. But in the absence of that, yoga helps a lot. And when none of those things are available, bottle of wine and a Netflix binge.
I recently developed an allergy to yeast, and I can't drink wine or beer or cider. So I was dry for, 6 weeks, no alcohol. And, had to be like, okay, so grief's still here. I was happy that it wasn't in any more or less quantity that I had. I wasn't like dulling down. It was like a pretty steady state of grief. But I kind of had to do the same thing where I could just give myself permission not to use the anesthetic of productivity. I needed to just like cry into my pillow and just be like, you know what? I know it's daylight and I'm just going to stay here, and like, I'm just going to keep using a book as a way to keep putting me back to sleep, because I fall asleep within 20 minutes of starting to read. Pretty much. Same kind of thing though, that it's like, I have to give myself permission to use those healthy ways of coping with grief and rage, because so many of my ways of coping are unhealthy, like productivity, like working and things like that.
Oh yeah. I've been there too. You know, when my grandma Lucy passed away 8 years ago, I was working as a community planner. And I remember one night in particular, there was a bunch of drama, family stuff going on around it. And I'd been up till 4 a.m. Like it had been straight days and days of just craziness, traveling and stuff. And then that night I'd been up till 4 a.m. with some crisis. And I woke up at 7 and was in the office by 8, like dying, you know? Yeah. And my boss came in, he's like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, I have so much work to do. And it was totally just pushing it off, not facing it. And so, ugly crying in the car, you know, when a song comes on, like I've done all of it. Yes, I think counseling would probably be a good thing. Hopefully that's a skill and a lesson that I'll learn as I get older.
I really appreciate your honesty, because that's really what I'm going for. And I've heard interviews. I can't remember what it is. I'd have to ask my husband Ruben, but I know that there is a pretty famous article of well-known environmentalists like David Suzuki and Bill Reese and people like that. And it's like, what do you do to cope with demoralization? And like, to a man, it was drink. It was like, and these are, academics, these are, how do you cope when you're a climate scientist? And like so many of them,
oh gosh,
you don't cope. What are you talking about? How do you? So I really appreciate you setting the bar high with your honesty. Just saying like, just like the rest of us, I muddle through and try to use what feels good. And I do think that yin yoga, it's like, there's something gentle and releasing. And all that's good.
I think also like, I'm okay to hang on to it. Like as a facilitator, I think one of my skills is I always have this simmering level of my own sort of grief, and the tears are always pretty close to the surface. And it's kind of become a hallmark, I think, of my facilitation, that someone will cry at some point in the day. And I think that is very human, and not something to apologize for. And so, I try to give myself the space to feel whatever I'm feeling in the professional world. And fortunately, I think in our First Nations communities, that is really accepted. So not always trying to deal with it in the sense of like get rid of the grief and rage, but more like just recognizing that it's there, dealing with it in a way that allows me to carry on, but also not thinking that I need to carry on with a mask of cheerfulness or pretend that everything's all right when there's a lot of things that are not all right, and we need to hold that awareness, I think.
Absolutely. Those are very good lessons. And I would say that in my limited time, like relatively limited time, probably more than most of my fellow settlers, but in my limited time in community and circle with First Nations, and listening to elders and listening to truth and reconciliation testimony and things like that, I really learned about spaciousness in discourse, and just, like, okay, somebody's feeling emotional and then everybody just waits. Like, it's totally not a big deal. Maybe somebody will go up and stand beside them as like a supporter. But there's no kind of talking over it. There's no rushing to help. And there's just no rushing. There's just like tons of spaciousness around that. And then the wave passes and the next thing comes. And you feel, I have felt more bonded in the human family because of that, because people haven't rushed over and been like, but you're doing so, like there hasn't been the rush to pacify or sort of nullify that. I really learned that's something that I don't feel in my bones. And what really inspires me though by that is it actually is learnable. I've gotten really good at just waiting, not like impatiently, but just like waiting it out in myself or other people, and like letting people wait for me. And like not letting people stand there and apologize for them, being emotional, but just like telling, that's okay. That's been, that's really enriched my life. So I've definitely appreciated that. I said it was the last question, but I have one more, and this might actually be too tangential, but, I brought up truth and reconciliation, and, so you're a person who's walked between the worlds, and just like the rest of us in Canada, you have to walk this path of reconciliation. When I listen to you, though, your story does not sound like a sort of quote unquote typical Indigenous experience. Like, how did your family, and if they did, how did they sidestep the residential school legacy?
Yeah. This is another great question. I think about this really often. So my grandmother was mixed, settler and First Nations. So her mom was Gwa'sala in English, and her dad was Nakwaxd'axw in Scottish. And so my great grandfather, James Henderson, or Pa, I think the stories sort of go that he made a pretty intentional decision to try and raise his kids with, on the farm, away from the traditional territories, outside of the big house system. And I'm not sure of the logistics, but Grandma didn't have status, and so she went to Indian day school instead of residential school, I think. And so there was a sacrifice in the sense that Pa's brother, Numatsa, chose to raise his kids in a more cultural way. And now they have that culture so strong in their family. They're artists and singers, and, they're really in the cultural system. And my family is not, we don't have the artists and the singers and the dancers in the same way in our side of the family. And I think, so that was my great-grandfather's choice. And then my mom was the first one in the family to go to university, and she studied history and got pregnant with me when she was at UBC. And it's, just different choices along the way to be in a different world. And so I remember in my mid-20s, I was having a bit of an identity crisis, because you're right, I did not grow up in the typical way that a lot of my colleagues and my peers did. And I think I didn't suffer as much as a lot of them do, and a lot of this, how the stereotypes play out. And so I had a lot of feelings of guilt about that, I think. Like, what right do I have to be working in communities when I didn't even grow up super Indian, or I don't have this history of all these abuses and stuff. And what right do I have to be leading this work in communities or to call myself First Nations, da, da, da. And I remember like really beating myself up over this. And then I was sitting on my back porch one day, and it was like a flash, like a cathartic, paradigm shift. And it was just like this message of, do you know how fucking hard those previous generations worked so that I could be exactly where I am with exactly the level of privilege and wellness that I have? And like, how fucking entitled to feel cheated by that, when who knows how many generations back they had to make tough choices and sacrifices so that the next generation could have what they had or live in that different way. And so get over yourself, Jessie. You're where you are because we put you there, and your job is to take every advantage that is gifted to you by virtue of our sacrifices, and to recognize that you are just one link in this chain that stretches infinitely backwards and infinitely forward. And get over it. And so that really has been the foundation for my work ever since. I think I stopped feeling apologetic about that, and realized that it was my obligation to those generations that made those sacrifices to appreciate and build on the gifts that I've been given.
That is so beautiful. That made us both cry, and we didn't hold space because we were both like, I don't want to cry right now. I don't want to have snuffy videos. But like, that was really beautiful. I love that image that you're a link in a chain that's infinitely backwards and infinitely forwards, and it's just another beautiful way to describe you walking between the worlds. Thank you so much for being on the show, Jessie.
Oh, my pleasure, Carmen. You're awesome. Keep up the good work.
Isn't she lovely? I'm not exaggerating when I say that Jessie changed the course of my life with her words. Like, she's just that magic. And to continue the paradox of how she walks that tightrope between different worlds of belonging, I have to say that although Jessie carries many identities, ultimately, with Jessie, what you see is what you get. She's pure heart. And you can feel it, can't you? You can find out more about Jessie in the show notes, but I want to highlight that if you're involved in any capacity with urban planning, public consultation, community engagement, or reconciliation work, maybe building settler Indigenous alliances, you should check out Jessie's company, alderhill.ca. That's ALDERHILL.ca. And just see about bringing her and her colleagues, Elaine and Chris, into your community to learn about and experience some of their culturally based planning processes. Just before we wrap up, I want to give a shout out to my listeners in Ecuador. Ecuador? I don't understand. How do people find me? I don't know, but I love it. Thank you. Thank you for spending time with me. And in case you missed it, I've announced the dates for my wilderness quests in 2017. What do you think? You, me, 12 days in the woods, walking the path of spirit together? Get all the details at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. And until next time, take care.